Well, this is a broadcasting history interview with recording on April 1st, 2006. And our guest for this interview is Brian Ross, the Chief Investigative Correspondent for the ABC network. He's been in that job since 1994, after some 20 years with NBC, and is certainly one of the world's most respected broadcast journalists. So, Brian, if after all this time, it's wonderful to be sitting across from you and have this opportunity to explore your experience in broadcasting, which goes all the way to Channel 7.
Channel 7 and before. I really feel I was born out of Iowa broadcasting.
And, well, we're glad you were, that's for sure. Well, let me just remind the viewers who see this tape that we're talking with one of the world's most respected electronic journalists, and that's reflected in the array of awards that you've received, Brian. 4 duPont-Columbias, 4 Peabodys, I think it's 9 Emmys, 3 Overseas Press Awards, and also Sigma Delta Chi Award, going a little further back into your career. And most recently, a George Polk Award for exposing the CIA's secret prisons in Europe and the allegations about holding Al-Qaeda suspects in those locations. And that's just to name a few. You are here in the Twin Cities to receive another award, which those of us in this part of the country greatly value, named after a great journalist and teacher, Mitch at the University of Minnesota. So congratulations on that latest, and we're very grateful to have you here.
Thank you. It's a great honor.
Let's sort of touch a little bit on what you've been doing. Investigative reporting, I suppose, might be defined as telling stories that a lot of people don't want to tell or don't want to be told.
That's a pretty good description. Some have said it's almost a redundant term. All good reporters should be investigators, but they tend to be stories in areas which are perhaps more difficult to obtain, and I think you've put your finger on it, the stories that people generally don't have an interest in having told.
You have to break down some kind of a door to get to the story in the first place, and that takes pretty aggressive reporting.
It does, and it's the opposite really of what I call access journalism, where people on Washington beat sort of get their stories because they get friendly or do favorable stories. It's the opposite.
Mm-hmm. And that's pretty tough business, isn't it?
It's every day is a full day, and but there's never been a shortage of stories. It's just a question of which ones do you have time to get to, what will be most important. Sometimes there are dry holes. You think you have something, you can't get it good enough in the air. That can be frustrating, but for the most part it's rewarding. Every day since I started in Iowa, every day is rewarding for me. I get up excited to go to work and feel that way now.
And of course, your reports these days are showcased on World News, Good Morning America, 2020, and on ABC Radio. So you really get on a wide platform, probably much wider than few reporters do.
We do, and the stories now are more and more playing a prominent role on the ABC News website, abcnews.com, which I think truly 10 years from today, that will be the principal way most Americans get their news, is they will go online and be able.
That's where it's headed.
It's all headed, and you'll be able to get a radio report, be able to get a video report with similar ease, and that will be. I think it's a great day for journalism because it will be able to free us from the constraints of having to have with sort of this experience where you have to watch the beginning of the show, and to get to a certain story you might click off. Now you can essentially, viewers can create their own newscast. Here's what I'm interested in.
It really is going to put that in the hands of viewers, isn't it?
It's very democratic, but I think it's liberating for journalists.
Well, it certainly is going to make a lot more information, more accessible to people who are willing to use it. Unfortunately, not as many people who use it as should, probably, for good citizenship. I'm sure that must be a little frustrating for you.
It is, but I actually think that the websites will actually change substantially. I think Americans are interested, but it's difficult sometimes to get there. Don't forget, the early newscasts really go back to the farm days. 5:30, everyone was home, and they were able to watch the news, and that's when they wanted it, and grew out of the great radio stations, WMT, all the great radio, the beginning of it, and the newscast at 6 o'clock. Where I live in New York, very few people are really home to watch the news at 6, and there's an audience that wants it but cannot see our broadcasts. And I think with the website, they'll be able to see when they can see it.
So you're looking down the road to the future.
We're spending a lot of time on that right now. I think the future is here now, really.
Well, let's go from there. Brian, a place called Charles City, Iowa. I believe you were Chicago born, and you wound up at a little college out there.
Right. Well, this is the part of the story that college students should ignore as a lesson for their own lives. But I went to school in high school in suburban Chicago at a very good high school, and I was the editor of the school paper, and I fell in love. As the editor of the school paper, somebody from Chicago picked me to do a high school sports show, and I was on TV, and there was a local radio station. I completely fell in love with the entire business of news and being aggressive.
You were really hooked.
I was hooked. And my first year college was at Northwestern University, and I had the misfortune of being the news director of a small radio station in a town where there was a murder of Charles Percy. He was running for the United States Senate, and 6 weeks before the election, when he was running for the U.S. Senate, his daughter was killed in his mansion in Kenilworth. Yeah. And that was such a big story, and I concluded, of course, mistakenly, but I concluded this is so much more interesting to me than going to school and learning about journalism and covering the city council or the student council. This is a really big story. It's a national story. And frankly, I just didn't go to school. And at the end of the first semester, or the first year at Northwestern said, if you ever get interested in education, you might want to come back, but right now, we have no place for you. And to be honest, at a time when if you weren't in college, you were going to Vietnam. Yeah. And like a number of others, several hundred, people looked for colleges, and there was this sort of for-profit school in Charles City, Iowa. About half of the kids were from Chicago, and they were people who couldn't get into schools or had other sort of sordid tales like mine. And I landed in the small town of Charles City. And that's how I got to Charles City. That's how I got to Charles City.
From one of the most distinguished journalism schools.
Right, to a school nobody had ever heard of.
Well, it all worked out.
It all worked out, and I immediately got there, and so frankly, school was very easy at Charles City. It wasn't really a great college, and right away I sought work at the radio station KCHA in Charles City, and I was able to hook up with KWWL in Waterloo. Right. And I became the morning reporter, did the Today Show cut-ins. I'd get up at 4:30 or 5 in the morning in Charles City, and the days that my car would start, and drive on into Waterloo and do the morning radio with Eldon Ebert, if you remember Eldon Ebert. Right. And would do the Today Show cut-ins, and then that's really how I learned to cover the police beat. I would go over to the courthouse and to the police station in Waterloo, and just go through the blotter, make calls to all the sheriffs. We had 18 counties we called. You know that very well.
Well, and for those who are interested in technicalities, we just had a little edit here. We just managed to blow a circuit with our lights, so we're resuming the interview with Brian Ross at this point. And Brian, you were telling us that in addition to attending this little college in Charles City, and I assume you went to class there occasionally.
I did go to class there. I learned my lesson.
But you worked for the radio station, and you were also with stringer correspondent for the television.
I had a morning job there, and worked every morning and drove. And among my at Charles City College was this farmer and John Deere employee, Charles Grassley.
Oh, Charles Grassley was your teacher.
He was my history professor.
For heaven's sake.
And we became very close and remain close to this day. In fact, I'll be interviewing him in a couple of days.
A long way with Chuck,
So he was a state representative, and I would get with him all the time. Had an interest in politics as well as news, but working at, and I would occasionally do stories with him. And I worked every weekend at KWWL. I probably 40 hours a week there.
I didn't realize that you were involved as much as you were with them that early on.
And I worked then with, Eldon Ebert, Dean Frine, and George Lipper was the news director who hired me. These were great teachers. I mean, I learned so much more in the basement of that building than I learned at any school I went to. And I went.
It was a great. I'd like to, and we'll develop that a little bit further. But I'd like to go back to a humid summer afternoon in the 1960s when all hell broke loose in Charles City. And you were there, and
I was
you were
there.
one of the first people on the air with that story when the radio station finally got on the air.
Right, the tornadoes that cut through the state that day, Owine and Charles City. And I had been at the station in Waterloo, and the weather report suggested there would be big storms, and so I had never really seen a tornado. Chicago boy, and I had my Bell and Howell silent camera and a tape recorder. Started driving out towards that way, and sure enough, Charles City. So I got to Charles City, and it was either warnings were up for the county, and you could see down Main Street this huge storm. I've never seen anything like it.
Coming from the south.
Coming from the south. People were running, and KCHA, it was in an old bank. And so I think I was the last person on the street before everybody else had gone inside. And I was the last one to sort of see Charles City as it ever was. And I put my tape recorder outside on the steps, figured I'd get some sound, and went downstairs in the basement where the bank vault was where we all went. The employees
so you finally could go inside.
We finally went down there, and you could feel the pressures. Everyone's done the interviews, but one of the people in the basement, his ears started to bleed from the drop in pressure, and then it passed, and we heard this sound, as you've heard it so many times described, as if it were a freight train. Back upstairs outside of Main Street, and Charles City wasn't there anymore.
It literally just about totally wiped out that downtown where you were in the basement.
Came right through, and that was about a quarter mile or a half mile from where the Charles City College was located. And of course, I took as many pictures as I could, tried to figure out, this is before cell phones, figure out a way to get on the air somehow.
So you couldn't move around very well.
Couldn't move around, and you sort of, people were stunned, and that in fact was the first time I was ever on a national radio broadcast. I filed for Mutual Radio out of Charles City. Mm-hmm. And I think I was on the air, on KCHA, and filing stuff for Channel 7. It was quite a series of days.
Do you remember how you got your first film out then? If you had some of the...
Well, one of the cameramen had shown up, and I gave him my film.
You gave him your
film.
And
I stayed, and I was on the air. Once KCHA was back on the air, and this goes to the power of local radio. That was what really helped the whole town together. And so I was on the air all night, and as the death toll rose, I can't remember how many now exactly, 9 dead or 14. I
think it was 9 dead.
Yeah. Right. And a devastation to the town.
Devastation beyond anything that had happened before or since in Iowa.
Right.
Because Owine was similarly devastated, although the death toll down there was only 1 in Owine and 2 in Maynard, just outside.
I remember making my way to the hospital, the Charles City Hospital. Pickup trucks were coming in, and there were people in the back who were dead, clearly. And one man had sat outside, essentially been beheaded by the power of the storm. It was grim.
Very grim. Well, but here you are. Were you about 18, 19 years old then?
19.
19. So your baptism was really...
Right. I started to think, I'm sort of I'm attracted, or am I attracting news stories? Because again and again, there have been so many incidents where I have ended up exactly in the right place from the point of view of a newsman. You wouldn't want to have my luck if you're an ordinary person, but as a reporter, I mean, I've ended up on planes that were hijacked. I got off a bus in New York one night and was there 30 seconds after John Lennon had been shot. I was the first reporter on. I sort of wonders there's something going on here, but in any case, that was a that was a real learning experience. And
well, so you had a Bell and Howell camera which had 100
feet
of film in
right,
it, and that lasts about 2 minutes on
right.
tape.
So you learn to, you do learn to shoot sparingly, but you shoot as much as you can,
right.
And then I'm out of film. So I think I had 4 or 5 rolls with me. I never really anticipated.
Right. But you were there. You were actually there filming as the storm
yes,
approached.
Right.
Which I had never heard before.
Yeah.
I don't. Unfortunately, none of that exists.
I don't know what those films. The archiving of that material just was on the air.
They've done a great job of archiving the experience up there
right.
at that museum, but there's very, very little. Well, of course, there's a ton of still pictures,
right.
But virtually no video at all. Well, that's a kind of an aside.
But yes,
we're looking for that kind of information
sure.
for the archives at all. Well, later on, then you're already well established with Channel 7 while you were still in Charles City. And then you made a decision, I take it, to get a little more serious about formal education as well.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, one of the things I haven't talked about much is that Charles City, it was a for-profit school with questions about the administration of the school and who was running it, and questions I didn't shy away from trying to do stories about as well. So I was a controversial figure, sort of, because I would try to do stories about my own college.
Okay.
And the combination of those questions and the tornado, the school went out of business.
Yeah. Did
and
you enroll then?
I went to Drake University.
You went to Drake first.
All the students then were looking, well, now we've had a year, and we actually had some interesting, I think, learning experiences. And who will take these credits?
Mm-hmm.
Drake University would take the credits.
I see.
So I applied and was accepted at Drake, and I moved to Des Moines, and did 2 things. One, tried to become initially sort of the Des Moines stringer for Channel 7.
Right.
And then and earlier had spent some time working on one of the political campaigns. I worked came close with Dave Stanley, who ran the United States, and just worked
Intrepid Dave.
for about 3 months in his campaign. And when that failed, I stayed at Drake and was active, working for KWWL, and
So you kept your connection with them.
Yeah, and I covered Bob Ray, and generally I would take the bus on Friday afternoon up to Waterloo, work a weekend shift.
Okay.
Sleeping on the couch there in the vending room.
Yeah. Sleeping on the couch.
Yeah.
So did you do a semester there, or?
I did a year and a half really. I liked Drake, and then I transferred to Iowa.
Okay. So that puts you at Iowa in about what year then, Brian?
I was in Iowa then. It would have been, I guess, 1970, beginning of 1970.
So you landed at Iowa right pretty much in the middle of, and that is your presence. You would have been involved in the Vietnam era turbulence that was going on.
Well, once again, I was, for a journalist, in the right place at the right time, and frankly, I had moved to Iowa at the urging of Dave Stanley, who, after having lost the Senate race, decided to challenge, if you recall, Fred Schwengel in the Republican primary to run for U.S. Congress.
First district.
Yes, and I worked for him for a few months, going back and forth between Muscatine, and he lost. And so
he lost a lot.
He lost a lot. He spent a lot of money, and
he was a good guy.
Good guy, and just didn't connect with somehow with the voters. But he was always very helpful to me and a mentor in many ways of discipline and hard work. Right. And so when the campaign ended, I again connected with Channel 7 and became their Iowa City correspondent, again armed with a tape recorder and a bell and howl. And at that time, Grant, it was $7 for a film story and $3 for a radio story.
That's more than we were paying.
No, I recall competing against you. It was not easy, and I would the film would have to be on the, I think it was 11:45 bus to get to Waterloo in time for the 3:30 film run. And radio could be filed at any time, and sometimes I would be able to do a phone track that would link up with the footage. Other times it would just be the footage, and I still have these sort of weekly sheets I would submit for all the stories that I did when I was city.
Again, those would be copies of them would be valued.
Oh, I'd be glad to send them to you. They're just sitting in my basement. I haven't.
Well, you landed in Iowa on the university campus, still working for Channel 7, at a time when, again, I'll use the phrase, all hell broke loose.
Right. Once again, it did. And this time it was over Vietnam, bombing in Cambodia, invasion of Cambodia, Kent State. And in that spring semester at the University of Iowa, I'll never forget it. The ROTC building, you recall, they blew up, and virtually every night the students found a way to antagonize the Johnson County Sheriff's Office and essentially successfully create a disturbance every night. Yeah. And school was barely going on, and I became, like most of the other students, we almost had a vested interest in it going to pass-fail, because virtually nobody was going to class or not paying much attention. And if they really had insisted on tough grades that semester, I don't know what they would have done. I was certainly on the streets all night, try to get up in the morning, go to class, and then get that footage on the bus so they'd have it for the 5:30, the 6 o'clock newscast. And that was. That's
what you were doing.
That's what I did.
Well, it finally erupted into a situation, at the time you were down there spending 24 hours a day covering the story. I was the news director sitting back in Waterloo, listening to my crew down there wearing helmets and having cement blocks thrown at them from the overpass.
Right. Oh, sure. Sure. It got ugly. It's surprising. I recall thinking, these are fellow students in there. They would go after the reporters, and it wasn't clear exactly why.
Nobody was quite sure of why on anything.
No, and what was it really all about? I mean, certainly there was the pressure that these were young men who were faced with going to that war and didn't want to. And part of it was just a contagious spirit, and it was emotionally. It was a spring day. It was fun to be outside, certainly, than inside studying. A lot of things combined there.
Fires and the whole thing.
Oh yeah.
And here comes the National Guard.
Right.
National Guard.
Yeah. It was
shuts her down.
Yeah.
In April.
Yeah. Just an amazing time to be on that campus.
There has to be a stronger word for that, but I don't know what it is.
As you sort of try to keep some objectivity about it, but and it was an early lesson, I think, in trying to, I certainly had identified in some ways with the students, but also with the authorities, and there wasn't a lot of middle ground there. And tried to go back and forth between the two groups as a reporter. I was a student, but I was also trying to be a reporter, and I think students were critical of the establishment that was the sit-ins and so on.
The students were just it was a national phenomenon, of course.
Right.
But that is an unprecedented. Of course, there was a good deal of some pretty rough stuff went on at Iowa State also, but not to the dimension that it reached at Iowa City. So you all went home, as far as students are concerned, in April, and called it a draw.
Right, I guess pretty much.
But you got credit for the...
I got credit because they went to pass-fail, and everybody got through it. And then, I continued to work through the summer, in Waterloo. I lived at the Y. had the same sort of daily work, and then in 1971, May of '71, I was graduated from university. To this day, of course, still check myself that I actually got that degree, but I did.
You did.
Yeah.
Well, they are very proud of the fact that you did. You've been inducted into their Hall of Fame down there and have been very supportive of that journalism school. And I think you put some context on your passion to do news with that training, didn't you?
Absolutely, and it was it was a troubled time for that journalism school as well. They had a crisis of themselves as to how to approach education for young journalists,
Right.
and what's the sort of the best way. And I found it to be a little bit disconnected from the real world, particularly given what was going on. It seemed really
Was that the guy?
it seemed really distant from the real world, and
He marched off in a different direction.
right. It was almost training. It seemed to be a academic or a professor of journalism. It was not training that really I felt. I thought I was learning a lot more on the street every night than I was, frankly, in the classrooms.
But you were learning a lot more in the street than most folks were.
Right, exactly. No, not everybody was out there, and but that was that was a great time in a way to be a journalist, to see that right in front of you.
Well, then, not surprisingly, when you were hired full-time then at Channel 7, and you began your full-time work there.
Right after graduation, and I sort of cooked up my parents had given me a ticket to fly to Europe as sort of a graduation present. So I recall kind of coming up with a idea which they bought, that I would do a series of stories in Europe.
Really?
And so I went to some John Deere tractor factory in Europe and did a whole...
Tied into the John Deere?
Absolutely, and talked about agriculture exports. The NBC office in Paris is very helpful. I sort of got a real taste, like,
What are you doing?
how are you going to keep them down to the farm after they've seen Paris? That was sort of me.
Right,
I sort of thought, this is fantastic.
Well, you spoke of some of these, the people that you worked with, Dean Frine.
Yes.
Eldon Ebert, their names were almost synonymous with local news.
Right.
Waterloo.
Great men. I just learned so much every day from just to watch them work, to be guided by them. And they were so patient with me. Who knows what they really thought about this kid there. I was eager, but I just soaked it all in.
And George Lipper was your first news director?
He was the one who hired me.
George was a real journalist.
He was a real journalist. He was tough, and I think that I always, when I briefly worked in the suburbs of Chicago, I had worked one summer on a newspaper with a person like George Lipper, who also was a tough, no-nonsense. He liked nothing more, as did George, going after the mayor or the police chief. Nothing would thrill him more to do that, and that stuck with me. And that's to this day what I do.
Well, that was a period after the innovator of that station, R.J. McElroy, of course, died prematurely. Mike was a street fighter who did what probably no one else could have done. Stripped away the license from a guy called DuPont,
Right.
and got the television license for Channel 7, but never really understood, in fairness to him, it's a tough business back in 1953, running
Right.
a television station.
Right.
Didn't make any money.
Right.
So you had to keep the place open, and he did it with any means he could find.
Right.
And that didn't involve putting very much money into either personnel or resources as far as the station was concerned. You got by with what they had. Mac died, and he was succeeded by a man named Robert Buckmaster.
Right.
I'm sure you ran across Mr. Buckmaster.
Quite a bit.
And he came in at a different time, but with an entirely different philosophy.
Right.
And George Lipper would be a representation of that. He was determined that that station, which was getting its head beat in at that time by
you.
guys down the street
Right.
on Channel 2.
Right.
Weren't going to go on that way indefinitely.
Right.
And he started pulling together a news organization that Frine and Ebert and Lipper and later Kelly came.
Blake Kellogg.
Kellogg, yeah.
Yeah, Blake Kellogg came in from Wisconsin, and he then sort of took charge, and he was the person who really gave me the first full-time
He knew
job.
something about television.
He knew something about television, and he was aggressive and had a sense that I just wanted us to be everywhere. I wanted to go to every parade, every fair, every event. We're going to be all over the Northeast. And he loved Northeast Iowa, really. He became passionate about it, and I was one of that kind of that.
And you were just to the extremity of that situation was that even though Channel 2 was a Cedar Rapids-based television station, we had more news audience in Waterloo than Channel 7 did
Right.
when McElroy
Right.
was running. And that was the kind of wall that you were going up against.
Right.
And that had to be a very exciting environment. Brian.
It was, and hired just a bunch of young guys like me, and it was just go as fast as you can, and it was everything to beat Channel 2, get there first. We have the police scanners. We chase the auto accidents, chase the tornadoes, chase whatever it was. Drive all day. Charter flights. I mean, there was some money to be spent, and it was just a time to be exciting and as aggressive as you could be.
And Buckmaster was willing to spend it.
He was willing to spend it, and
going to make that investment for a head-on bumping heads
Right.
with the competition down the road.
he wanted to own his market. Yeah.
And he closed the swinging door on personnel on the front door to
Right.
Channel 7 and started bringing some stability to on-air personnel. A guy named Tom Peterson.
He brought in Tom as the anchorman from Wisconsin.
O'Connor Sports.
Yeah, Michael Connor Sports. I had Jeff Goodall in the weather. And
Jim Goodall.
Jim Goodall, because Jeff was his younger brother, was a cameraman. That's
There were
right.
A lot of Goodalls.
A lot of Goodalls around there, and worked with them all. And it was, there weren't too many women. There were a couple of them there, and but that was the team. And man, we just worked and essentially worked together, ate together, drank together. It was just a rare experience.
Mike Beecher was around there at that time.
Mike Beecher was there. I'm trying to think who else was shooting there. Then Darwin Paustian, John Emmert, director in Florida. Bob Holitz, who now works out of Detroit, went on to government in Iowa.
And Holitz became the full-time correspondent at the State House.
That's right.
Which you were sort of doing on a part-time basis
Yeah.
when you were a student at Drake. The concept
Right.
was there, but it's pretty hard to be. But Holitz was a heck of a political reporter.
Right. Very, very good, very sharp. And
Right.
his skills, obviously, now he uses them in the private sector, shall we say, but I still keep in touch with many of those people.
Well, let me go back to your Iowa City days. When I first began to hear the name Brian Ross, it was from my own staff, Channel 2. They didn't like you very much. You were pretty aggressive.
I was aggressive. I didn't want to get beat. I sort of felt that it was, that's how I was going to do it. I was going to push, and I'm still like that today. I'm not pals with the people at CBS or even NBC. I go to work every day, and I just want to beat them.
Yeah, so this was an inclination very early with you because
Right.
it was very you were aggressive, but my people were they'd get mad when you'd stick your microphone when they were
Right.
an interview.
Yeah.
Well, okay, I've seen a lot of that
Right.
happen
Right.
in various places.
But I grew up watching TV in Chicago, and that's how they did it there, and that's how I was going to do it. And I just sort of had that you go back and you look at sort of that history of the Chicago journalists. They were extremely aggressive,
Right.
and I don't think I ever stole a story from anybody, but I was willing to piggyback, and I wasn't going to get beat.
So you I think one of the stories I remember Beecher telling, the interview I did with him, was that you barged into a John Culver private meeting, and John was quite a bit bigger guy than you.
John Culver came to really dislike me very strongly. That did not end well.
Yeah, he tossed you out of that meeting, as Beecher tells.
Yeah.
Do you remember that one?
I can recall. I'm trying to think of the details.
Had several run-ins.
But the Culver thing was long lasting. I mean, he had a famous temper, and I felt the full brunt. And
John he was a fiery guy.
He was, and you know, we really tangled. And frankly, I can't recall the specific issue, but
no, of course not.
But we did
but
tangle.
That was representative of you're again. So the well, let's get you down the line, or sort of the bridge here. You were, well, let me say that what you just described, what you were doing, what Frine was doing, what Ebert was doing, Peterson and O'Connor and Goodall and Holitz and all the rest of them, that started to make a dent down there at Channel 2.
Is that right?
Yeah, of
course. You felt it.
You started to get you started to crystallize the part of the audience that was north of Highway 20. With the aggressive kind of, you know, as you say, you were chasing everything that moved and a lot of things that didn't move.
That's right.
And so we started to get some pressure from that happened to all be the period in which the consultants were coming into the mix, and Maggot was there at Channel 2, and that presented some problems for me because Maggot and I didn't see eye to eye on any one thing that I could ever think.
Good for you.
And the long and the short is that eventually I wound up at Channel 7, and I was very grateful to be there. But this is not my story, it's just the connection.
Right.
You made a real reputation as a reporter at Channel 7 and wound up with a heck of a market jump all the way to Miami.
Right. Well, of course, I moved sooner than I wanted to because you know, I guess it's probably true today. My boss would say the same thing today, but I don't really know bounds very well. I always test the boundaries.
Well, Bradley was around too.
Yeah. Bradley was there, Jim Bradley, and then what's his name? Bolster, Bill Bolster was. And there would be regular clashes in the newsroom in the morning in which Bolster and Bradley would accuse a number of us being communists. Why are you covering these anti-war protesters? The woman whose son was killed by friendly fire, the growing American antipathy and then opposition to the war. And it was fiery there, and sales and news were not always seeing eye to eye. Right. I worked my heart out for the station, though, and I think that overcame a lot of that, because I'm not really, even to this day, I'd have a hard time defining my politics, but I'm generally, whoever's in power, I see as somebody who should be looked at hard.
Right, and I think that's a perfectly legitimate journalistic.
Right, and when it was Clinton, when it's Bush, and whoever it is next, look out. That's how I see it. But there was lots of tension there. And, I think that the Young Turks at the station, we sort of began to feel our oats. Yeah. And then I got cut down because there was a controversy in Waterloo. Buckmaster is the owner of the station and is the head of the Chamber of Commerce. They were backing the new interstate that was going to go up to the Deere factory. And their weekend was going to be a large protest of people whose homes were going to be in the way of the highway.
The diagonal route.
And Buckmaster ordered that was not a news story, we shouldn't cover it. Well, on the weekends at KWWL, there really is no management. I was the morning sign-on, I was the assignment editor for television, did the pieces, and we in fact covered it and put it on the air. And the following Monday, 3 of us were fired.
Okay.
Bob Holitz, Darwin Paustian, and I were all fired the same day.
They got a triple.
By Tom Peterson. And Tom Peterson was the one with tears in his eyes, because he just knew. I mean, he didn't have a choice. He had been named news director. Kellogg had left for Wisconsin. Right. and Peterson got the orders.
Yeah.
Because I think at that point, I think Burns Nugent was gone, but I think Bradley was the boss. And
Bradley was the executive vice
Yeah,
president.
right.
So he was really, Buckmaster was the CEO
Right.
and president.
Right. It was essentially, on my part, a complete insubordination. There's no doubt about it. But I just felt armed with my degree from the University of Iowa that I knew journalism, and this was a story, and these people were out there, and I imagine Channel 2 was covering it, and not only we covered, we put it on the air. Yes, and we put it on the air, and then it was October, I think, of 71. And so I had worked there, maybe 5 months full time, and suddenly
You're out
I was fired. And I sort of started thinking of, have I just really blown it completely? This is how careers end long before you want them to.
Right.
And I really hadn't even thought about it. I wasn't like one of those people who was looking for the next job always. I was just completely engrossed in the work, and I had never thought about where I'd work. After that, for a second, I figured I'd be there 5 or 10 years. I hadn't even considered it. And suddenly I was out of work, Hollis was out of work, Poston was out of work, and I collected an unemployment check for about 4 months. And then Blake Kellogg had been the news director and had gone on to become the press secretary for the governor of Wisconsin. Completely understood. And he'd had his falling outs, I think, with Bradley. And he offered me a job, and I became the speechwriter for the governor of Wisconsin.
Okay.
For about 4 months, and it was the worst job I ever had in my life. I detested it. I was on the inside looking out. I knew too many things. As a reporter, I was too frustrated.
Right.
I didn't like any part of it. And then I started looking for a job, and I got a job in Miami and made that jump.
Right. Well, that was, did you have a connection, and was Emmert down there at that
No,
time?
I brought everybody down with me.
You
I brought
got that-
a
in other
whole
words, you
gang down
came out
there.
of that firing at Channel
Yeah.
7, took a look at the world of politics, and got yourself a job in Miami.
In Miami.
That's an incredible story.
And in early '72. And again, good fortune, that was, I went to Miami at a time when there were Watergate burglars
Yeah.
were under investigation. It was about to blow.
Oh, he landed right in the middle
Nixon
of it.
was there every weekend at Key Biscayne. The two conventions that year, Republican and Democrat, were both in Miami Beach. The lead senator from the state, Ed Gurney, was under criminal investigation for housing kickbacks. I covered all those stories and was completely in heaven.
And you were in a very sophisticated newsroom down there.
Channel 7 at WCKT. Very, again, aggressive newsroom, and really based on what I had done in Waterloo, I was perfect for that news director. He was a difficult person, and no one liked him, but he was aggressive, and he was like George Lipper and Blake Cogg. They wanted to go after the mayor, the police chief. He came up with the idea when I was there, and we did it. We went around and would go up to police and say, "Officer, I just found this wallet. Could you turn it in for me?" And we, of course, had taken all the pictures of the money and everything. And then we went back and checked. And of 30 officers, I think about 25 kept the money in the wallets. And this was all on hidden camera. And that was my first Peabody Award, was a police corruption story in Miami. And but that was the kind of in-your-face, aggressive reporting that he took it a notch beyond Waterloo.
Right. Well,
But I got there, though, because I didn't plan to be there, but there I was.
well, you must have gotten there with, so that news director must have talked to you about what an unpleasant reporter you were.
Right.
In terms of the good sense of that word.
Right, but at that time in Miami, strangely enough, the salary was no better than the salary in Waterloo.
Really?
It was the same money. And he used to say, "We pay with sand in your shoes,
Yeah, right.
sunshine and sand in your shoes."
Right.
And so they didn't really, they do now, but at the time, they did not really get sort of the people that were in Chicago, San Francisco, Los Angeles, the top markets. They were getting people like me from small places, and then I could then proceeded to raise as many people as I could from Iowa to get them jobs.
And so you were, Emmert went down there and wound up in a news director position.
Yes.
He didn't.
He's still there today, and he was a very, very good friend of mine, and he was my roommate, in fact, when I lived in Waterloo, and brought him down. He became, part of the sports operation, which he was very interested in, and John McBride, who was a top cameraman.
Very good photographer.
And brought him down. He worked with me at Channel 7 in Florida, so...
Which certainly says something about the kind of skills that you had developed there at Channel 7. I mean, after all, this is 1970s television.
Right.
It was getting pretty sophisticated.
It was, but when I got there, and there was certain anxiety on my part. I'm coming from Iowa, and I'm in Miami.
Yeah.
But we did it just as better in Waterloo, and I realized right away, I can do this, and everybody I worked with back in Waterloo could do this. We can be here. We're just as good, which is a credit, I think, to what they built in Waterloo.
Oh, it absolutely is.
We were just as good in Waterloo as they were in Miami, if not better.
Well, you decided probably you'd like a little bigger salary, and so you wind up in Cleveland. Is that what?
Well, then I started to see there was room to grow, and I became pretty much as I was in Waterloo in Miami. I became a real thorn in the side of the state's attorney, and my first raise in Florida came when Senator Gurney, who was trying to sneak out the back door of a grand jury, and I had figured out what back door he would use, threw a punch at me. And fortunately, there was an AP photographer who shot it. And the news director saw it and said, "You just got yourself a $25 a week raise." And so I became then the lead sort of investigative, you'd sort of, please do the two murders plus the investigative story as well. That's how it worked. There was no...
But that's where you really made the transition.
Oh, then it was the CIA, the CIA up against B.B. Rebozo. It was not the Johnson County Sheriff anymore. It was the White House.
Yeah.
And I got a taste because the network people were always in there, always working. And there was a big plane crash in the Everglades. The Eastern flight went into the swamps there, and it was a big story. And some of my stories started to get on NBC. And I was approached for a job at the NBC station in Cleveland about 2.5 years later. And I took that. And at that time, the NBC O&Os the news departments were run by the news division, by NBC News.
Yeah.
It's no longer the case.
Yeah.
Now they're run by the local station managers. But the NBC operation was that it was essentially
NBC News.
NBC News. They didn't do any of the junk. We weren't doing shopping center openers.
Right.
They wanted serious, and they brought me to Cleveland. The news director there was aggressive, just in the same style as Lipper and Kellogg and Gene Stroll in Miami. And he wanted to go after the Teamsters Union because they were trying to organize the police.
Where you started the foray with the Teamsters Union.
Right. I'd sort of got to know Meyer Land, the gang in Miami, and organized crime. They were paying off local politicians. But when I got to Cleveland, the most powerful group there was the Ohio Teamsters, Bill Presser and Jackie Presser. And they controlled the Central States Teamsters Pension Fund, and Jackie was the younger son. And I went right after them, and in a very aggressive set of reports that won another Peabody and a DuPont Award. Right. And then I was really recognized at NBC at the national headquarters. Reuben Frank and Julian Goodman and Richard Wald. And
all good men.
And then great men, and then as luck would have it for me, Jimmy Hoffa disappeared. And they said in New York, well, who knows about these Teamsters? Well, there's this kid out in Cleveland. And I was loaned out for 2 weeks.
I see.
And never went back. That was how I broke into network television.
So Jimmy Hoffa's demise opened another door.
Another door for me, and I ended up being brought in, and we did on the NBC Nightly News, and it was John Chancellor and David Brinkley, a 5-part report. And the first time anybody had thought you could do this on network television. This is 1976 now. 5 nights on the Teamsters, which every night, and I guess I was 27 years old. And and I was young for a correspondent even today, and that's how I started. And people say, well, you may not be ever able to top this. I don't know if this is such a good thing for you.
Well, those Teamster guys play pretty rough, don't they?
They played very rough. In Ohio, the FBI at one point approached me and said, we have a report they might try to put a bomb on your car. And that was common. That was standard technique by the Teamsters / mob in Cleveland, was to plant bombs. At one point, Presser's wife called me. She realized that he was having an affair with some banker, and the one person she thought that could hurt him the most was me. So she called me and started talking to me, and she made the allegation to me that there were he would meet regularly with FBI agents, and she thought he was paying off FBI agents. So I thought, this is quite a story, and I asked the FBI, and they scoffed at it. Only because I learned that Jackie Presser was in fact a FBI informant. She was right. It wasn't that he wasn't paying them. They were essentially paying him. But they played very dirty, and that was, that's one of the times when it was very hairy.
Mm-hmm. So at NBC, your career then evolved to investigative reporting at the national, international level.
Right.
And
it was labor corruption, mobsters, and then as sort of the drug wars, the cocaine wars evolved, my experience in Miami was very valuable because I knew that whole world. And so I became very active in reporting from South America, quite a bit on cartels from Medellin and Bogota. I was down there a lot.
didn't you get thrown off an airplane down there one time?
Well, I actually jumped off there. I was on a plane that was hijacked.
Still on the ground.
I had been down there covering the in the U.S.-backed secret armies, and had been out in the jungle since 1982. This is a while ago, and which I thought was the most dangerous part of the assignment. And we got through it, and I was on the plane, and as it was about to land at the Capitol, where I was to get a jet to New York, 4 guys jumped up with dynamite and guns, and the plane was hijacked. They landed the plane. We were held for 3 days and 3 nights. It was very tense. They were rigging the plane with explosives, and the hijackers planned to go out the back steps with the Latin passengers and have 19 Americans up front. And it was about midnight, and they left us alone for the first time, and I said to this other fellow who was a labor negotiator for United Fruit, and he had been told he would be the first to die, and I'd been told I'd be the second. That was their targeting. And we said, we got to, this is it, So we pulled the exit windows and dived out of the plane onto the tarmac, which it's a long way down. I still have some of the, sometimes like...
I remember the images. Right.
And escaped. They opened fire, but we all got out. So that was the plane experience. That was...
So the other...
all the Americans got off.
The Americans got off.
And then they had nothing else because they were trying to seek local support. It was a group that had trained in Cuba, they told us, and they were trying to change the government. And so they just negotiated a return to Cuba.
So you started out getting caught by a tornado at Charles
Right.
on the spot,
Right.
And getting hijacked in was that at
Honduras.
Honduras?
Tegucigalpa. There.
Well, and again, when you were dealing with those drug cartels, you were dealing with some pretty tough people there too.
Very ugly, and many of the times I would go down and do a story and then fly back and put it on the air from New York. But at one point, one of the presidential candidates was assassinated in an open-air speech by the cartels. We flew down, and I did about a week of stories. And one morning, we're at breakfast. The worked with the Iris Silverman and the camera crew in the big hotel, and this guy, one of the sicarios, they call him, skinny kid, black leather jacket, in, looking around, sees our table, and he walks over, and he puts his hand like this, and he pulls out a Polaroid, takes, and then runs out. I thought he was going to pull a gun. But the embassy people said, it's they're on you now. You got to get out of here. They know where you are. You are marked. That's what that was about. So we left that night.
So you did.
Came back a week later, but you change hotel every night. I found you can move around fast. You'd be okay. But
what's that when you? I mean, I'm fascinated by your stories, but they're not stories; they're real experiences. How does a personal? How do you get back to bacon and eggs in the morning?
Well, I try to explain to my wife and son. I know it's interesting on a personal level. I think the hijacking for me was, in a way, sort of a personal turning point, because I've had a sense ever since then that this is sort of borrowed time. I think I was very close to being killed then. And I guess I felt more than ever to make what I do count and make it important.
And just, a little more substantive.
Right. And also to, on a personal level, that, that I dated various people that hadn't been very serious, and I decided that, I want to have a family, so I got married and have a son now who's in high school, and I still, I went to Baghdad. I still take risks, but I don't know. I'd like to think maybe they're a little more informed.
More selective.
Yeah.
On them maybe. Well, that kind of. First of all, to sort of go back to, I think you hit on it pretty well, but the tenacity that underlies what you have done was very evident very early in your career, but it was substantially shaped back there in Waterloo, wasn't it?
Without a doubt. Without a doubt. That was again and again, and then just, it's the experiences, but at the time, the men that I worked with there, Dean and Eldon and Blake and George, and they shaped the reporting. And I can recall George going over scripts with me, and you got to be tough on these guys. You cannot let them get away with it. Don't be afraid to ask the question. We would have fascinating. There was at one point, one of the police chiefs or a police official had used the N word. Mm-hmm. This is the time on the east side of Waterloo there was racial trouble, and had used that in a comment, and there was a substantial debate about whether we should broadcast that. Right. And I was mostly a spectator, but it was so informative. On one hand, we have an obligation. If that's how he's talking, the world should know. Right. On the other hand, we are a community operation, and if we do that, we're likely to have a night of rioting, and maybe there'll be deaths. Yeah. I don't really know my own opinion now, but at the time, it was just to see men and sort of with a very thoughtful, kind of collegial, strongly held views exchanged back and forth, and this happened every day. Yeah. Every day.
And in Waterloo at that time, that would have been. I mean,
absolutely.
It was bad enough as it was.
Right. They did not air it, and I think they felt, and that's what I think you have.
Sometimes you have to make decisions.
Right. I wouldn't have make it. I might have made the wrong decision.
And that's where it takes. Even Brian probably needs an editor.
We all need editors. That's the most important thing I've had. I think are excellent editors. Yeah. You've gone too far here. You shouldn't. I guess I can be a loose cannon sometimes, and I need an editor, and I count on. I have that at ABC now. I had it at NBC, and I certainly had it in Waterloo with those men.
Well, the other thing that I just sort of wanted you've got to deliver a speech here, and we could go on for several hours, but we won't do that. I want to explore a couple of things with you, Brian. You mentioned Ira. He worked with you for years. You don't do the kind of work that you've done all by yourself. You're not a one-man band once you get to that.
Anyone who knows anything about television knows there could not be a more collaborative effort. And there's so many people who, now it's a very large team. I actually work with a team of about 15 people who are developing stories, researching stories. And you can't really do this at a level that will be quality, will be authentic, will have integrity, unless you really have, or you can do fewer stories. Right. And the economics of the business they want to have they like it, which is a good thing. They like these stories, they want to have a lot of them, and it requires people who are we call them producers. They're really reporters. That's the real name for them.
Right.
Television term is producer. But
The other thing that it seemed to me, obviously, from this conversation, you have to have a lot of guts. You had courage from day
Yeah.
one. But you also have to have sources. And how you develop sources when you're basically working in an area where you have to deal with hostility, because we started out saying you want to tell stories that somebody doesn't want you to tell.
Right.
So how do you develop sources for that?
I think early on, I made the decision. I'm not a stenographer. I'm not just there to take down what officials say. And I don't really want to be the person who's delivering the spin. You know, the mayor and the police chief will have their own view of things. I want to be in with the people in the field. And these, for my money, these are the people, you know, who took an oath, you know, in the case of the FBI or the local police. They believe truly in what they're doing. And the reason they tell me things is they believe their agency has gone wrong or something has gone wrong. Sometimes they want some credit, but primarily the best stories I've had are from people who feel this is something the American public knows. And when my interest in theirs can line up in the same way, this is something that should be out, should be known, that's when it's the happiest relationship.
Deep throat.
The deep throat. And then now in the case of Deep Throat, Mark Felt was a high-level FBI official, and you know I wouldn't have had a source like that.
But it's
Right.
the
It's that kind of
concept.
thing where it feels like there's something wrong here. The stories I did about the CIA and its alleged torture techniques, what are its interrogation techniques, what about these secret prisons, came from people inside the CIA who could not be more patriotic in the country. But they feel this is not the CIA they signed on to work for. And they're disgusted by what they've seen, and they feel it's almost their obligation to talk about it. And that's where I think that's the best way you call this for a source. That's the best relationship with a source, I think, where you really have people who are who truly believe in it. And I think we're challenged now because we've seen, you know, the White House use the confidentiality rules essentially to slime, you know, Joe Wilson.
Right.
That's not really investigative reporting. And our whole notion of how we protect sources is challenged because of that. Mm-hmm. And I wonder whether we should be in that business of granting confidentiality to high-level White House officials who want to use us as the messengers for you know, political spin and you know, dirty deeds.
But part of the reality of that is that your situation is pretty unique. On a long history that has been illuminated considerably by what we've talked here today, the reputation that you have for developing stories that nobody else can develop. But to do what you do, you have a tremendous amount of resources behind it.
We do, and you know,
these organizations not willing to invest in that.
right, and I think, you know, the president of ABC News, the man I work for now, David Weston, is cut from that same cloth. He believes, one, that's very important, but two, and this is the world we live in now, that it is a fair way to succeed commercially. Mm-hmm. That everyone, by the time we're on the air at 6:30, everyone's seen all the news, you know, and our White House story and their White House story are not going to look any different. But if we can bring on stories that are unique and original, that's what we're delivering that nobody else gets. And that's is the theory, and I think it's successful, why people watch ABC News. So to that extent, there is a kind of research investigative reporting. And now both NBC and CBS have copied what they're creating units similar to the one that I'm pleased to work with.
Mm-hmm. That's encouraging.
Yes.
It is. It really is. Because certainly the spin doctors of the world have reached their tentacles into the business pretty heavily.
No, they have, but I think that we cannot deny or forget that these are commercial operations. These are not charities. We don't work for PBS. We work for operations that are in the business to make money. Mm. But telling important stories is a way they can make a profit, I believe.
That goes back, well, it goes all the way back to Channel 2.
Right.
You do news well.
That's right.
And you make tons of money.
Right. And that's what you did. You story.
didn't.
Well, you at WM, you didn't make any money, but you were the,
Right.
yeah, you sure did.
But what I did was, well, I was hired, after all, if you're a news director, what president of ABC News, you
Yep.
still work for.
That's right. Yeah.
And you have sometimes, well, but again, to go back to the taking on Channel 2, building that news department with George Lipper and Frine and yourself and the other young Turks that worked on it, that paid off
Yeah.
big
Right.
for black broadcasting.
Right.
That was Buckman's success. He spent enough money to develop quality that was competitive, and the end of that story was a radio station that was capitalized at $35,000 generated a company that was sold for $40 million less than 30 years later.
And that should be a Harvard Business School textbook case study of how to invest in something, and is investing in local news and in good news coverage. I think people want that. There's just no doubt they do.
Well, I hope so.
Yeah.
I hope so,
Yeah.
Brian. I urgently do.
Right.
You're a wonderful example of the benefit that can come from real journalism.
Well, thank you very much.
It's been a real pleasure to spend this hour with you.
Well, I'm happy to be here. Thanks. Okay.
So much.
You bet. You bet.